Soon an opening presented itself. Among the Ghatfan was a man by the name of Nu'aym bin Masud, who had become a Muslim but had kept his conversion a secret. A prominent figure in the region, he was well known to all the three major partners in the alliance, the Quraysh, the Ghatfan, and the Jews of Bani Qurayza. He was also a very capable man. Nu'aym left the Ghatfan camp one night and slipped into Medina. He came to the Prophet, explained his position, and expressed his desire to be of service to the Muslims. "Send me where you will," he said. This was just the opportunity for which the Prophet had prayed. In a conference with Nu'aym, the Prophet went over the entire situation and laid down the course of action which Nu'aym was to take. The same night, Nu'aym stole into the settlement of the Bani Qurayza and visited Ka'b. He outlined the dangers of the situation as they applied to the Jews. "Your situation is not like the situation of the Quraysh and the Ghatfan," he explained. "You have your families and your homes here, while their homes and families are at a safe distance from Medina. They have no great stake in this battle. If they do not succeed in defeating Muhammad, they will return to their homes and leave you to face the wrath of the Muslims. You must take no action in collaboration with them, unless they give you hostages from their best families. Thus you will have an assurance of their good faith." Nu'aym next went to the Quraysh and spoke to Abu Sufyan, who knew him well and had respect for his judgment. "You have made a pact," he said, "with a people who are treacherous and unreliable. I have come to know through friends in Medina that the Bani Qurayza have repented and entered into a fresh pact with Muhammad. To prove their loyalty to Muhammad, they are going to ask you for hostages from your best families, whom they will promptly hand over to Muhammad, who will put them to death. The Jews will then openly come out as allies of the Muslims, and both will make a joint attack against us. On no account must you give hostages to the Jews." He then went to the Ghatfan, where he painted the same picture. By the time Nu'aym had finished, the seeds of doubt and discord had been firmly planted in the minds of the allies. The uncertainty began to tell on Abu Sufyan, who had relied unquestioningly on the alliance of the Jews. He decided to hasten the course of battle and put the intentions of the Jews to test. During the night of Friday, March 14th, following the visit of Nu'aym, he sent a delegation headed by Ikrimah to the Bani Qurayza. "This is a terrible situation," explained Ikrimah. "This cannot be allowed to continue any longer. We attack tomorrow. You have a pact with us against Muhammad. You must join in the attack from the direction of your settlement." The Jews hummed and hawed for a while, and then came out with their terms. "Our position is more delicate than yours. If you have no success, you may abandon us, and then we will be left alone to face the wrath of Muhammad. To make sure that this does not happen, you must give us hostages from your best families, who will stay with us until the battle has been fought to a satisfactory conclusion. Anyway, tomorrow is Saturday, and Jews are forbidden to fight on the Sabbath. Those who break the Sabbath are turned by Allah into pigs and monkeys." Ikrimah returned empty-handed. Abu Sufyan then decided to make one more attempt at persuading the Jews to join the battle on the morrow, and sent another delegation to Ka'b, but the stand of the two sides remained the same. Quraysh: "No hostages, fight tomorrow." Jews: "No fighting on the Sabbath, anyway, hostages first." All three groups now said, "Nu'aym was right. How wise he was in his advice to us. Nu'aym had done his work well. The Bani Qurayza had been neatly detached from the alliance." The next morning, Saturday, March 15th, Khalid and Ikrimah, tiring of the delay and seeing no hope of concerted action by the allies, decided to take matters into their own hands and try to force a decision one way or another. They moved forward with their cavalry squadrons to a place just west of Zubab, where the ditch was not as wide as in other places, and where it could be cleared on horseback or by men scrambling across on foot. This place was right in front of the Muslim camp, which nestled at the foot of Sila. Ikrimah's squadron moved up first, and a small group jumped the ditch. the horses landing neatly on the Muslim side. There were 7 men in the group, including Ikrimah and an enormous man who urged his enormous horse ahead of the group and began to survey the Muslims, who were surprised by the sudden appearance of the Quraysh. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable duels of history, which, because of its unusual course, is here described in full detail. This huge man was a tremendous height and bulk, and while on his feet would tower above his fellow men. Sitting on his great horse, he looked positively unreal, big, strong, and fearless. He had a fierce countenance, an aspect which thrilled his comrades and dismayed his enemies. This was Amr bin Abdu Wud. We shall call him the giant. Horse and rider stood motionless as he let his gaze wander scornfully over the ranks of the Muslims. Suddenly the giant raised his head and roared, "I am Amr bin Abdu Wud. I am the greatest warrior in Arabia. I am invincible. I. He certainly had a high opinion of himself. Is there anyone among you who has the courage to meet me in personal combat?" The challenge was received by the Muslims in silence. They looked at one another. They looked at the Holy Prophet, but no one moved. For the giant was famous for his strength and skill, and though wounded several times, had never yet lost a duel, nor spared an opponent. It was said that he was equal to 500 horsemen, that he could lift a horse bodily and hurl it to the ground, that he could pick up a calf with his left hand and use it as a shield in combat, that he could— the stories were endless. The vivid Arab imagination had created around this formidable warrior a legend of invincibility. So the Muslims remained silent, and the giant laughed with contempt, a laugh in which the Quraysh also joined, for they stood quite close to the ditch and could see and hear all that went. "So is there none among you who has the courage of a man? And what of your Islam and your Prophet?" At this blasphemous taunt, Ali left his position in the front rank of the Muslims, approached the Holy Prophet, and sought permission to engage the challenger and silence his insolent tongue once and for all. The Prophet replied, "Sit down, this is Amr." Ali returned to his position. There was another burst of scornful laughter, more taunts, another challenge. Again Ali went up to the Prophet. Again the Prophet declined permission. More laughter, more taunts. Again the challenge from Amr, and this time more insulting than before. "Where is your paradise?" he shouted, "of which you say that those who lose in battle will enter it? Can you not send a man to fight me?" When for the 3rd time Ali moved towards the Prophet, the latter saw in Ali's eyes a look which he knew well, and he knew that Ali could no longer be restrained. He looked at Ali fondly, for Ali was dearer to him than any other man. He took off his turban and wound it around Ali's head. He next took off his sword and girded it at Ali's waist, and he prayed, "O Lord, help him." This sword, which the Prophet now gave to Ali, had once belonged to an infidel by the name of Munabbah bin Hajjaj. This man had been killed at the Battle of Badr, and the sword had come to the Muslims as part of the spoils of war. The Prophet had taken the sword for himself. Now in Ali's hand this was to become the most famous sword in Islam, killing more men in fair combat than any sword in history. This was the Zulfikar. Ali hastily collected a small group of Muslims and strode out towards the unbelievers. The group stopped at some distance from the giant, and Ali stepped forward and got to within dueling distance of the challenger. The giant knew Ali well. He had been a friend of Ali's father, Abu Talib. He now smiled indulgently at Ali, as a man might smile at a boy. "O Amr," called Ali, "it is believed that if any man of the Quraysh offers you 2 proposals, you always accept at least one of them." "True." "Then I have 2 proposals to offer you. The first is, accept Allah and His Messenger and Islam." "I have no need of them." "Then dismount from your horse and fight me." Complete audiobook playlist link available above and in the description. Like, share and subscribe. "Why, O son of my brother? I have no desire to kill you." "But I," replied Ali, have a great desire to kill you." The giant's face flushed with anger. With a cry of rage he sprang off his horse, displaying a degree of agility surprising in so huge a monster. He hamstrung his horse, drew his sword and rushed at Ali. The fight was on. Amr struck at Ali many times, but Ali remained unharmed. He would parry the blow with his sword or shield or nimbly step aside to let the giant's sword whistle past him harmlessly. At last the giant stood back, panting and baffled. He wondered how this could be. Never before had any man survived so long in personal combat against him, and now this boy was looking at him as if he was playing a game. Then things happened so fast that no one could quite follow the sequence, neither the Muslims, nor the Quraysh, nor the giant himself. Ali dropped his sword and shield to the ground. His body shot through the air like a missile and his hands grasped at the giant's throat. With a wrestler's kick he knocked the giant off balance, and the giant came crashing to the ground, all in a matter of seconds. Now the giant lay on his back with Ali sitting astride his chest. The two armies gasped and murmured, then held their breath. The bewilderment on the giant's face changed to fury. At last he had been thrown, and by this young upstart who was less than half his size, but although he was down, he was not finished. He would still win the battle and re-establish his position as the greatest warrior in Arabia. He would toss this youngster into the air as a leaf is tossed by the wind. The giant's face went purple, the veins stood out on his neck, and his huge biceps and forearms trembled as he strained to break Ali's grip. But he could not move it an inch. There was the quality of steel in the muscles of Ali. "No, O Amr," said Ali gently, "that victory and defeat depend upon the will of Allah. Accept Islam. Thus, not only will your life be spared, but you will also enjoy the blessings of Allah in this life and the next." Ali drew a sharp dagger from his waistband and held it close to Amr's throat. But this was more than the giant could take. Was he whom Arabia considered her greatest champion to live the rest of his life under the shadow of defeat and disgrace? Was it to be said of him that he saved his life in personal combat by submitting to the conditions of his opponent? No. He, Amr bin Abdul Wud, had lived by the sword. He would perish by the sword. A life spent in violence must end with violence. He gathered the spittle in his mouth and spat into the face of Ali. He knew what would happen. He knew that there would be a sharp intake of breath, that Ali's right arm would shoot into the air and then plunge the dagger into his throat. Amr was a brave man and could face death without flinching. He arched his back and raised his chin to offer his throat to Ali, for he knew what was to come. At least he thought he knew. But what happened next left him even more bewildered. Ali rose calmly from Amr's chest, wiped his face, and stood a few paces away, gazing solemnly at his adversary. "No, O Amr, I only kill in the way of Allah, and not for any private motive. Since you spat in my face, my killing you now may be from a desire for personal vengeance, so I spare your life. Rise and return to your people." The giant rose, but there was no question of his returning to his people a loser. He would live a victor, or not at all. Intending to make one last attempt at victory, he picked up his sword and rushed at Ali. Perhaps he would catch Ali unawares. Ali had just enough time to pick up his sword and shield and prepare for the fresh assault. The blow which the giant now delivered in furious desperation was the most savage blow of the encounter. His sword shattered Ali's shield, but in doing so lost its force and impetus, and could then do no more than inflict a shallow cut on Ali's temple. The wound was too slight to worry Ali. Before the giant could raise his sword again, the Zulfikar flashed in the sunlight, and its tip slashed open the giant's throat. The blood of the giant gushed forth like a fountain. For a moment the giant stood motionless. Then his body began to sway, as if he was drunk, and then he fell on his face with a crash and lay still. The earth did not shake with the impact of that colossal body. The earth is too big, but the hill of Silah shook with the cry of Allahu Akbar that thundered from 2,000 Muslim throats. The triumphant cry echoed through the length and breadth of the valley before it faded away into the stillness of the desert. The Muslim group now rushed at the 6 remaining Quraysh. In the sword fighting that ensued, one more Quraysh was killed and one Muslim fell. A few minutes later, the Quraysh group turned and hastily withdrew across the ditch. Ikrimah dropped his spear as he jumped the ditch, on which Hassan the poet wrote many a rude verse. A man known as Nawfal bin Abdullah, a cousin of Khalid's, was not successful in clearing the ditch and fell into it. Before he could rise, the Muslims were on the bank and hurling stones at him. Nawfal wailed, "O Arabs, surely death is better than this." Thereupon Ali obliged the man by descending into the ditch and cutting off his head. The Muslim group now returned to camp, and a strong guard was placed at the crossing. On the afternoon of the next day, Khalid moved up with a squadron, intending to succeed where Ikrimah had failed. He tried to cross the ditch, but this time the Muslim guard at the crossing saw him advance and deployed in sufficient time to prevent his crossing. There was a heavy exchange of archery in which one Muslim and one Quraysh were killed, but Khalid was unable to cross. Since the opposition at the moment appeared too strong to overcome, Khalid decided to resort to stratagem. He moved his squadron back as if he had given up his intention of crossing the ditch, and placed it at some distance from the ditch. The Muslims took the bait, and believing that Khalid had abandoned his attempt to cross the ditch, withdrew and began to relax, waiting for the peace and quiet of the night. Suddenly Khalid galloped back with his squadron, and before the Muslim guard had time to redeploy, a few of the Quraysh led by Khalid managed to cross the ditch. But they had not advanced far from the ditch when the Muslims formed up again and held Khalid within the small bridgehead which he had occupied. Khalid tried hard to break through, but the Muslim resistance was too strong, and he had no success. There was some hand-to-hand fighting between the Quraysh group and the Muslim guard in which Khalid killed one Muslim. The savage also was there, and with the same javelin that he had used against Hamza at Uhud, he killed a Muslim in this sally across the ditch. Before long, however, seeing the situation as hopeless, Khalid broke contact and withdrew across the ditch. This was the last major military action in the Battle of the Ditch. For the next 2 days, there was no activity except for a certain amount of sporadic archery, which did no damage to either side. The Muslims now ran out of food, but their courage was hardened by desperation, and they were determined to starve rather than surrender to the hated infidel. In the Allied camp, tempers rose and spirits fell. Everyone knew that the expedition, which had been expected to lead to a glorious victory, had ended in fiasco. There was widespread grumbling, and what made the situation intolerable was the fact that no one could find a way out of the impasse. Then on Tuesday night, March 18, the area of Medina was struck by a storm. Cold winds lashed at the Allied camp and howled across the valley. The temperature dropped sharply. The Allied camp was more exposed than the Muslim camp, and the storm appeared to strike the Allies with a vengeance. It put out fires, knocked down cooking pots, carried away tents. The Allies sat huddled under their blankets and cloaks as the storm raged around them, waiting for an end that would not come. Abu Sufyan could take no more. He leapt to his feet, and raising his voice against the storm, shouted to his men, "This is no proper abode for us. Men and animals have suffered grievously from exposure. The Bani Qurayza have turned out to be pigs and monkeys, and have betrayed us in our hour of need. The storm has ravaged our camp, put out our fires, knocked down our tents. Let us return to Mecca. Lo, I am one who goes." Having made this last speech, Abu Sufyan jumped onto his camel and rode out with his men, hoping to get away from the pitiless storm. But the demons of the storm were to pursue him the whole night. The Ghatfan now came to know of the movement of the Quraysh, and so did the other tribes. Without further delay, they mounted their camels and departed for their settlements and pastures. In the rear of the Quraysh army rode Khalid and Amr bin al-As, with their cavalry squadrons acting as a rear guard in case the Muslims should come out of Medina, and attempted to interfere with the Quraysh movement. It was a bitter and disillusioned Abu Sufyan who led his army back to Mecca. The burden of failure lay heavy on his heart. The next morning the Muslims found the allies gone and returned to their homes. This was the last attempt by the Quraysh to crush the Muslims. Henceforth they would remain on the defensive. The Battle of the Ditch was over. Each side had lost 4 men. It was a victory for the Muslims in that they achieved their aim of defending themselves and their homes against the Allies, while the Allies failed in their attempt to crush the Muslims. In fact, the Allies failed to do any damage at all. The siege had lasted 23 days and had imposed a terrible strain on both sides. It had been ended by the storm, but the storm was not the cause of the raising of the siege. It was the last straw. Strictly speaking, this operation was a siege and a confrontation rather than a battle, for the two armies never actually came to grips. This was the first instance in Muslim history of the use of politics and diplomacy in war, and it shows the interplay of politics and arms in the achievement of the national aim. The use of armed force is one aspect of war, a violent and destructive aspect, to be used only when political measures fail to achieve the aims of the state. When a shooting war becomes inevitable, politics, with diplomacy as its principal instrument, prepares the ground for the use of armed force. It sets the stage, weakens the enemy, and reduces his strength to a state where armed forces can be employed against him with the maximum prospect of success. And thus is just what the Prophet did. He used the instrument of diplomacy to split and weaken the enemy, not only in numbers, but also in spirit. Most of the Muslims could not understand this, but they were learning from their leader. The Prophet's words, "War is stratagem," were to be remembered and frequently quoted in later Muslim campaigns. End of chapter 4.